My father walked onto my patio like a landlord inspecting a defective property. He didn't knock. "Stop being selfish. Your sister's twins need a bigger yard," Dad said, standing in my backyard with a realtor. "We're listing it next week. You'll stay in the garage apartment." My brother-in-law laughed. That night, his amusement would keep me awake, but right then, I just froze. The ice in my tea glass clinked against the sides, betraying the violent tremble in my hand to everyone standing there. Teresa hovered near the doors, ignoring her twin boys as they screamed. They wobbled in careless loops on their balance bikes, tires rolling straight through the chalk drawings my daughter, Lily, had spent all morning creating. Dad pointed toward the swing set I had built last summer. The realtor nodded, jotting notes as if my home were already sold. Nobody asked how I was. Nobody looked at me. I felt less like a daughter, and more like a squatter they were finally evicting. Kevin stopped laughing and scanned the yard. He looked like he was mentally rearranging the furniture. "A real house for a real family," he said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a targeted strike. I was a widow. Lily was adopted. In Kevin's eyes, our unit didn't count. We were just placeholders warming the seat for the biological bloodline. The cruelty of it sat heavy in the humid air, choking the breath from my lungs. I should have screamed. I should have told them to get out of my yard and out of my life. But my family had trained me early to be the calm one, the fixer, the wallet that opened without complaint. So I did what kept me safe. I smiled. Not warmly, but enough to keep the moment from exploding. "Got it," I said. The words tasted like ash. That smile was muscle memory. A desperate survival tactic I had perfected over decades of quiet servitude. Lily stood on the back step, clutching a paper snowflake she had cut for the kitchen window. Her fingers were dotted with dried glue. She didn't cry when Kevin insulted us. Instead, she watched the twins ride over her chalk city. She looked at me, waiting for me to defend us. When I just smiled at Dad, the light in her eyes went out. She folded the snowflake in half, pressing it against her chest, like she was trying to make herself disappear. "Thursday for photos," Dad told the realtor, not even checking with me. He looked satisfied, like he had just closed a business deal, rather than evicting his own daughter. "Go get your shoes, Ellie," I said softly to Lily. She nodded and turned around, walking inside without a sound. My father watched her go and didn't even flinch. I watched my daughter fold into herself, and I realized my silence was no longer a shield. It was a weapon pointed directly at her heart. The engines of their SUVs faded, leaving a silence heavier than the noise. I didn't scream. Instead, I started a mental spreadsheet. I calculated square footage in the garage apartment and estimated storage costs. It was a defense mechanism. If I turned this betrayal into a logistical problem, I didn't have to feel the sting of it. I wiped the counter down, scrubbing a sticky spot of jam until my knuckles turned white. It was easier to clean than to think. The house itself groaned under the afternoon's weight. This was Grandma Ruth's home, not theirs. She had left it to me in spirit, trusting my father to manage the legalities. I walked down the hallway, tracing the wainscoting. Every scratch held a memory of safety that was rapidly evaporating. My father saw dollar signs and property lines. I saw the only sanctuary my daughter had ever known being sold for parts. The air in the house suddenly felt very thin. I found Lily in her bedroom. The door was cracked open just an inch. Inside, the room was terrifyingly neat. Usually, her floor was a minefield of Legos and art supplies, but tonight, the rug was bare. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was the quiet of a prey animal hoping to be overlooked. My stomach twisted. She wasn't playing. She was waiting for the next blow to land. I pushed the door open gently. "Hey, sweetie," I whispered. She didn't look up. Beside her on the quilt sat her school backpack, bulging in a way that had nothing to do with homework. I stepped closer and saw the contents spilling out of the unzipped pocket. A toothbrush, 3 pairs of socks, a framed photo of us from the zoo. She wasn't packing for a sleepover. She was packing for displacement. She had done this before we adopted her. "What are you doing, Lil?" I asked, though I knew the answer. She finally looked at me, her eyes dry and terrifyingly old. "Kevin said real families need space," she whispered. "I don't want to take up too much room." The sentence hit me harder than my father's shouting ever could. I knelt in front of her, grabbing her small hands. "This is your room," I said. "You are not going anywhere." But her eyes remained empty. Her doubt mirrored my own cowardice. I had smiled on the patio while they erased her. I had agreed to the garage while they treated her like a squatter. My compliance wasn't keeping the peace. It was confirming her worst fear that love was conditional. Rage, hot and unfamiliar, finally began to melt the ice in my chest. I wasn't just losing a house. I was teaching my daughter how to be a doormat. That cycle had to end tonight. I stood up, ready to march downstairs and call my father, ready to finally scream. But my phone buzzed on the dresser. It vibrated against the wood, a harsh, mechanical sound in the quiet room. I picked it up, expecting another demand from Dad, or a taunt from Teresa. The screen lit up with an unknown number. The preview text made my breath catch in my throat. "Don't leave. Check the basement, Grandma." Grandma didn't text. Grandma couldn't text. The phone screen glowed in the dark kitchen. A lifeline thrown from a woman who supposedly couldn't even use a smartphone. Grandma Ruth hated technology. She called buttons fussy and screens cold. Yet the message sat there. 3 lines of impossibility that demanded action. I looked back at Lily, who was still frozen on her bed, guarding her backpack. "I'll be right back," I whispered, trying to sound calm. "Stay here." I needed to see what was buried beneath us. The basement door stuck in the jamb, requiring a hard shove to open. It groaned on its hinges, the sound echoing like a warning shot. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the junk drawer, its beam cutting a sharp cone through the gloom. The air down here was stagnant, smelling of wet concrete and old paint. It was a place for forgotten things. Shadows stretched long and warped against the cinder blocks, dancing in the corner of my vision. In the far corner sat the chest freezer. It was an ancient, rusting beast that hummed with a low, aggressive vibration. Dad had insisted we keep it plugged in, claiming it was good for emergency storage. Though we never put a single item inside. I had always thought it was just another control tactic, a way to dictate my electric bill. Now, standing in the damp silence, the appliance looked less like an appliance and more like a sentry. I approached it slowly, the flashlight beam trembling slightly. The floor around it was dusty, except for faint drag marks near the back wheels. Someone had moved this recently. I set the light on a shelf and gripped the freezer's cold metal edge. It was heavy, weighted down by frost and age. But adrenaline gave me strength. I heaved it aside, the metal shrieking against the concrete floor. The noise was deafening in the quiet house. Behind the freezer, the wall looked wrong. The paint was a slightly different shade of gray, a patch job done in haste. I crouched down, running my fingers along the baseboard. There was a seam where there shouldn't have been one. My fingernails caught the edge of a false panel, disguised as drywall. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled. The panel popped free with a dry snap, revealing a dark, narrow cavity between the wooden studs. My breath hitched as I reached into the insulation. My fingers brushed against cold metal and smooth plastic. I pulled out a heavy steel lockbox, the kind used for petty cash, followed by a thick manila envelope wrapped in protective plastic. The envelope had my name written across the front in shaky, familiar cursive. Daphne. Not the family. Just me. It felt illicit. Holding these things. It felt like I was robbing my own father, or perhaps, finally catching him. The envelope was thick, holding papers that felt stiff and official. I didn't open them yet. I tucked the envelope under my arm and gripped the lockbox handle. The climb back upstairs felt miles long, the wooden steps creaking under the weight of the secrets I carried. My hands shook as I set the cold metal box on the kitchen table. The weight of it felt like a bomb. I was about to detonate in the center of my life. I sat at the kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. The envelope seal cracked loudly, sounding like a bone breaking in the quiet room. Inside, a handwritten letter sat atop a thick stack of legal documents. I recognized the stationery immediately. It was the heavy, cream-colored paper Grandma Ruth saved for thank you notes, now covered in her shaky, determined script. Daphne, it began. If you are reading this, your father has tried to take the house. Her words were lucid, cutting through the fog of the dementia my father claimed she suffered from. She detailed how he had bullied her for months, demanding power of attorney under the guise of protection. She wrote that she had refused him explicitly. He didn't listen. She wrote, "He thinks I don't know about the withdrawals. But I see everything." My chest tightened. This wasn't just a dispute over real estate. This was a documented confession of elder abuse. Beneath the letter lay the true weapon, a notarized amendment to her living trust. The date was from 6 months ago, notarized by a lawyer I didn't know. It explicitly removed my father as the primary trustee and installed me in his place. The house is not his to sell. The clause read. The legal language was dry, but its impact was explosive. My father had stood in my backyard with a realtor, while having absolutely no legal right to sell the property. I reached for the lockbox next, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A small key was taped to the bottom of the letter. I inserted it, twisting until the latch clicked open. Inside wasn't cash, but stacks of bank statements and carbon copies of checks. I pulled the top stack into the light. These were the operating accounts for Grandma's care. But the numbers didn't make sense. The balance was dropping far faster than the nursing home fees required. My engineer's brain kicked into gear. Bypassing the heartbreak to focus on the raw data, I traced the withdrawals with a shaking finger. 5,000 here. 10,000 there. All written to cash or transferred to an account labeled T&K Joint. Teresa and Kevin. My sister wasn't just the golden child. She was the beneficiary of theft. I did the math in the margin. Over $80,000 had vanished in less than a year. They weren't just entitled. They were thieves. I found a final note, clipped to a foreclosure notice for Teresa's current house. He promised to fix this. Grandma had written in the margin. He lied. The urgency suddenly made sense. It wasn't about the twins needing a yard. It wasn't about family space. My father needed to liquidate this house immediately to cover the holes he'd dug in the accounts before the annual audit hit. He was desperate. He was broke. And he was going to sacrifice us to save himself. The fear that had paralyzed me on the patio evaporated, leaving only cold ash. It was replaced by a hard clarity that settled in my gut like steel. I wasn't the selfish daughter anymore. I wasn't the pushover who paid for weddings and fertility treatments to buy affection. I looked at the signature on the trust document one last time. I closed the heavy folder, trapping the evidence inside. I wasn't the daughter anymore. I was the trustee. And the audit was starting now. The sun rose with a deceptive calm, casting long, pale shadows across the kitchen floor where the metal lockbox still sat. I hadn't slept, but exhaustion was a luxury I couldn't afford today. I made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, the bitter aroma filling the space that felt entirely different now. It was no longer a waiting room for my inevitable eviction, it was a command center. I watched the wall clock tick toward 8, the second hand sweeping past the numbers with agonizing slowness. At 8 a.m. sharp, I dialed the number. Mr. Henderson answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly and professional. Miss Marroquin, he said before I could even introduce myself. Your grandmother told me this call might come. The validation hit me harder than the caffeine. We spoke for 10 minutes. His words efficient and sharp as a scalpel. He confirmed the amendment was filed, recorded, and ironclad. Your father has no authority, he stated flatly. You do. We sent notice via courier this morning. The legal shield was up. Now I had to wield the sword. I hung up and immediately dialed the bank's fraud department, my fingers moving with a steady, cold precision. This was the part that would hurt them the most. I authenticated my identity with the trust documents Henderson had emailed over. I need to freeze all linked accounts immediately, I told the representative. Suspected unauthorized access. One by one. I heard the confirmation codes read back to me. Every blocked transfer was a severance of the control they had held over me. I wasn't just stopping the money. I was cutting the oxygen line. The sound of small feet dragging on the hardwood broke my trance. Lily stood in the doorway, wearing her pajamas and clutching her stuffed rabbit by the ear. She looked at the boxes she had packed the night before, her face a mask of resigned dread. Are we leaving now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I knelt down, ignoring the stiffness in my knees. No, I said, looking her dead in the eye. We aren't going anywhere. Go get your chalk. We have a drawing to fix. We walked out to the patio. The morning air cool and crisp against my flushed skin. The tire tracks from the twins' bikes were still smeared across the stone. a gray scar on our sanctuary. I sat down beside her, the cold stone seeping through my jeans, and picked up a piece of blue chalk. Draw it bigger this time, I told her. She hesitated, then drew a long, bold line. We spent the next hour reclaiming the space, turning the gray smears into storm clouds that were passing away. My phone started buzzing inside the house around 9 a.m., a muffled vibration that grew more persistent with every passing minute. I could hear the distinct, angry pattern of my father's ringtone. Then Teresa's. Then the house landline started ringing, a shrill sound that echoed through the open door. They had tried to swipe a card. They had tried to transfer funds. And they had hit the wall I built. Lily looked up, the chalk poised in her hand, her eyes wide with the old fear. "Is that Grandpa?" she asked. "Let it ring," I said, shading in the roof of a new, larger house on the patio stones. I stood up and walked to the sliding glass door, the phone still screaming on the counter. I didn't answer it. Instead, I reached into the junk drawer and pulled out the fresh set of heavy-duty locks and the security camera I had bought months ago, but never installed. I picked up the drill. The first voicemail arrived at noon, a string of furious accusations, but I didn't listen to it. I was too busy changing the locks. At 2:15 p.m., the convoy arrived like a funeral procession for my life. My father's heavy SUV led the pack, followed closely by Teresa's minivan, both vehicles parking aggressively on the lawn I had just watered. They didn't park in the driveway. They claimed the grass, tires crushing the edge of the flower-bed Grandma loved. I stood behind the front door, watching through the peephole as they gathered. Dad wore his business suit, the one he used to intimidate contractors, while Teresa adjusted her hair, preparing for the realtor's camera. They looked like owners. They looked like predators. I opened the door before they could ring the bell, stepping out onto the porch and pulling it shut behind me. I turned the key, and the sound of the new deadbolt sliding into place was loud and final. Dad stopped on the third step, his smile vanishing when he saw my empty hands. "Where are the keys?" he barked, checking his watch. "The photographer is 5 minutes out. You need to be gone." He didn't ask why I was still there. In his world, my compliance was a fixed law of physics, as reliable as gravity. "The photographer isn't coming," I said, my voice steady despite the thumping in my ears. I canceled the appointment. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where his authority usually existed. Kevin stepped up beside Dad, laughing that same dismissive laugh from yesterday. "Stop playing games, Daph," he sneered, reaching for the door handle to bypass me. "We have a schedule." When the handle didn't turn, his smirk faltered. I stood directly in front of the wood, blocking their path. "This is private property," I told them. "You are trespassing." Teresa pushed past her husband, her face flushing a blotchy red. "Are you insane?" she hissed, gesturing to the minivan, where the twins were watching from their car seats. "We already gave notice on our apartment. We have nowhere else to go." It was the same weapon she always used. Her children as hostages to my guilt. "You're going to make my babies homeless, because you're jealous." She waited for me to crumble, to apologize and fix it like I always did. But the part of me that fixed things had died in the basement last night. "You aren't homeless," I said coldly. "You have a home." You just can't afford it, because you spent your rent money. I pulled the folded trust amendment from my back pocket and held it out. Dad snatched it, his eyes scanning the legal jargon with frantic intensity. I watched the blood drain from his face as he reached the notary stamp. He wasn't reading a document, he was reading his own sentence. The realization hit him physically. He staggered back a step, the paper crumpling in his fist. She didn't write this, he whispered. She did. I countered, stepping forward to reclaim the space he surrendered. She wrote it the day you tried to force her signature on the power of attorney. Dad's shock curdled instantly into rage. He lunged forward, invading my personal space, his face inches from mine. Spittle flew as he screamed. You manipulated a senile old woman! I'll have you in court so fast your head will spin. You are stealing this family's future. It was pure projection. A mirror of his own crimes screamed into my face. But for the first time, he looked small. Kevin tried to play the peacemaker, though his eyes were cold. Look, Daphne, we can work this out. Maybe you can stay in the garage for a few months while we get settled. He still didn't get it. He still thought this was a negotiation about square footage. There is no, I said, my voice cutting through his condescension. And if you ever mention the garage to me, or my daughter again, I will release the bank records I found in the lockbox. The mention of the records froze them all. Dad went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. He looked at the door, then at me, measuring his odds of physically moving me. He took a threatening step up, raising his hand as if to shove me aside. I didn't flinch. I simply pointed to the black dome, mounted in the corner of the porch ceiling. It records to the cloud, I said calmly. And the police are already on the way to serve the restraining order Mr. Henderson filed this morning. The fight drained out of them, replaced by the primitive urge to flee before consequences arrived. Dad threw the crumpled paper at my feet, muttering a curse that would have broken my heart yesterday. Today, it just bounced off. They retreated to their cars, engines roaring in frustration as they reversed over the lawn they would never own. I picked up the document, smoothed it out, and turned back to the door. As I stepped inside and locked the deadbolt, I looked at Lily and saw the fear leaving her eyes, replaced by awe. The physical silence of the house was immediate, but the digital noise began within the hour. My phone lit up like a slot machine with notifications from aunts, cousins, and distant relatives I hadn't seen in a decade. They called me ungrateful and heartless, regurgitating the lies my father had spun during his furious drive home. I didn't engage with any of them. I didn't defend myself. I simply tapped block on each number, severing the toxic limbs of my family tree one by one. It wasn't cruel, it was surgical. By Tuesday, the financial reality hit them harder than the emotional one. I received an alert from the bank that a check written to Teresa's landlord had bounced. My father had tried to claw back money that wasn't his, only to find the accounts locked tight. Mr. Henderson called to confirm the fraud investigation was open. They are panicking, he said. Your father tried to access the safety deposit box an hour ago. Security escorted him out. The image of my dignified father being walked out by guards brought me a grim, cold satisfaction. I knew desperation would lead him to the one person he thought he could still manipulate. I drove to the nursing home on Wednesday to prepare the battlefield. I handed the administrator the new medical directive revoking my father's access. The staff looked relieved. Apparently, his visits always ended with Grandma, agitated and weeping. I set up a calm perimeter, instructing the nurses to call me the second he appeared. I wasn't going to let him corner her alone again. He would have to go through me to get to her. He arrived at lunch, just as I predicted. I was sitting in the common room with Grandma when he strode in. He looked disheveled, his tie crooked, the veneer of the successful patriarch cracking under pressure. He didn't see me at first. He beelined for Grandma, putting on a sickly sweet smile that didn't reach his frantic eyes. "Mom," he boomed, drawing stares from other residents. "We need to sign some papers." He pulled a pen from his pocket, treating her like a vending machine that just needed shaking. Grandma didn't shrink away this time. She looked up from her puzzle, her eyes clear and sharp behind her glasses. The dementia, he claimed she had seemed to vanish in the face of his audacity. "I don't have any papers for you, Robert," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. The room went quiet. He froze, the pen hovering in mid-air. "Mom, don't be difficult," he hissed, grabbing her wrist. "Daphne is confusing you. You need to help me." It was the wrong move. The nurse station was already buzzing. I stood up then, stepping between them. "She isn't confused, Dad. She's broke because of you." My voice carried across the silent room. He recoiled as if I'd slapped him. "You stole $80,000 from her care fund." I continued, reciting the number like a verdict. "The bank records are with the police." The whispers started immediately among the staff and other families. He looked around, realizing he had lost the audience. He wasn't the victim here. He was the villain, exposed under the fluorescent lights. He looked at Grandma, waiting for her to save him, to cover for him like she had when he was a boy. She simply went back to her crossword. 6 letters for thief, she muttered. Bandit. That broke him. He turned and walked out without another word, his shoulders slumped. The security guard met him at the door to ensure he didn't come back. I sat back down, my hand trembling slightly. Grandma squeezed my fingers. It wasn't a triumph. It was a tragedy, but it was finally over. 2 days later, Teresa called. Her tone was different, no anger, just pathetic desperation. "They're evicting us, Daphne," she sobbed. "Kevin spent the deposit on a lease for a truck he can't afford. We have nowhere to go." She waited for me to offer the garage, to offer a loan, to fix it. The old Daphne would have transferred $5,000 just to stop the crying. But I looked at Lily, who was sleeping peacefully in her own room, safe because I had held the line. "I can't help you," I said. It was the hardest and easiest thing I had ever spoken. "But the twins," she wailed. "You have parents?" I told her. "Ask Dad. Maybe he has some of Grandma's money left." The line went dead. She hung up, realizing the wallet was finally closed. I deleted her contact info. There was no guilt this time, only a profound sense of lightness. I had cut the anchor that had been dragging us down. We were drifting, but at least we were floating. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of a parasite being removed from the host. I walked through the house, checking the locks one last time. They held firm. The nightmare of the last week began to recede, replaced by the mundane rhythm of a normal life. Lily was in the kitchen, making toast. She wasn't packing a bag. She wasn't checking the window for angry relatives. She was just a child in a kitchen, safe. That was worth every bridge I had just burned. 6 months later, the maple tree we planted in spring stood bare against the gray December sky. It was our first Christmas without the noise. There were no SUVs parked on the lawn, no passive-aggressive comments about the roast, and no frantic runs to the ATM. The house smelled of pine needles and cinnamon, not stress. I sat by the window with a hot mug, watching snow dust the purple roof of the birdhouse Lily and I had painted together. The silence wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. Grandma Ruth sat in the armchair, looking younger than she had in years. Since banning my father, her blood pressure had dropped, and her wit had returned sharp. She adjusted the red bow on her walker and winked. "Best holiday I've had in a decade," she announced, sipping her tea. Nobody asking for a loan before breakfast. We laughed, a genuine sound that filled the room. We weren't hiding from the family anymore. We were simply existing without them. Lily was the real barometer. Last year, she had opened her presents slowly, folding the paper neatly as if trying to leave no trace of her joy. Today, she tore through the wrapping like a whirlwind. Shreds of red and gold paper littered the rug, a mess that I had no intention of cleaning up immediately. She didn't look over her shoulder to check if she was being too loud. She didn't ask if she deserved the sketchbook and the deluxe marker set. She uncapped a marker immediately, the smell of ink filling the air. For an hour, the only sounds were the scratching of felt tips on paper and the crackle of the fireplace. I watched her work, her tongue poking out in concentration. She wasn't drawing a survival map or a tiny, apologetic figure in the corner. She was drawing bold, thick lines that took up the entire sheet. She was claiming the page, just as she had finally claimed her bedroom. "Done," she declared, holding the paper up. It was a portrait of our house, drawn with exaggerated proportions, and a massive yellow sun. Standing in the front yard were 3 stick figures holding hands. She pointed to each one with pride. "That's me, that's Mom, and that's Grandma Ruth." There were no twins on bikes destroying the garden. There was no angry man in a suit looming over the roof. It was a complete family unit, lacking nothing, bound by choice rather than obligation. Lily walked to the refrigerator, grabbing the roll of tape, without asking for permission. She stuck the drawing right in the center, covering a reminder for a dentist appointment. It wasn't just art. It was a flag planted on conquered territory. I realized then that I hadn't just saved a house. I had broken a curse. We took up space in our own kitchen, loud and happy. And for the first time in my entire life, I didn't apologize for it.